Hello, everybody. This is Roddy Gow from the Asia Scotland Institute. We're just waiting for Alex Ellis to come on, and there he is. Alex, how are you?
Sorry to be slightly late, but there we go. Got there in the end.
All right. Well, I'm very mindful of the fact that your time is pretty short. Alex, great to see you again. Thank you. During COVID, we had an interesting session before, and I think a lot of people know about your background, so we won't go into that because I want to make sure we use the time we've got available to the best possible means. Perhaps I should just start off by saying that we're also sorry to learn of this awful train crash in Balasore, which is terrible, and I hope that the poor people who are injured recover soon.
Indeed, thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, it's a great time to be talking because, of course, G20 is on, and India's presidency of that is important, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I wanted to see if we could start off by just you sharing your thoughts on the relationship between India and the UK. It's somewhat complicated by the Russian dimension and Ukraine, of course, and various other things. But I wonder if we could start there and then look at after that opportunities for people to do business with India.
Yeah. Well, there are plenty of those. So I think if there are kind of four very big things going on in the world, which are described in the integrated review refresh, which British government produced a few months back. One is obviously the increasing centrality of the Indo-Pacific to the world in terms of growth, but in many other things as well. Secondly, the much sharper geopolitical competition which exists, which you referred to, Roddy, of course, in terms of what's going on Russia-Ukraine, but not just. I think China and US is still the really big question. Thirdly, the very quick growth of the importance of science, technology, and data in all our lives, and including in relationships between countries. And fourthly, that you still have in a very divided, rather sharper world, some very big global problems, of which climate change and global health are the most obvious ones, but there are several others as well. And I would say in all four of those issues, India is an absolutely central country. It will be one of the three defining countries of the rest of my life. Not on the scale of China and the US. Its GDP won't reach those, but it will probably grow a lot. And so what happens in India will increasingly determine what happens in the world. And so there are huge opportunities in India. Every country has spotted them, so we're not alone. We have the uniqueness and the oddity of having a post-colonial relationship, which most of the time doesn't matter and occasionally does. Occasionally things go quite badly wrong. And my job is to try and help to make sure they go right. The Ukrainian war is, which you referred to in a moment, Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Indian government would have quite a different view of Russia from the UK government, and see Russia as an all-weather friend and a reliable partner. I think that what is happening as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is that they are no longer a reliable supplier of weapons to India, which they have been for the last 5 decades or so. And that's causing India to rethink a bit. If you're sitting in India, I think, and running the Indian government or indeed part of it, what you're really thinking about is the economic transformation of India, which you want to achieve in the next 10, 15, 20 years to kind of catch up, really, and to pull the country up to a higher middle income status. That's the big challenge. And you do that with the world which I've described, which is quite a bumpy world in which to do so. So for the UK, I think it will be one of the most important countries. We have a kind of register of British interest. I think India features third. It's third for most things in the world now, apart from populations where it's first. But it'll get to be the third biggest economy probably by the end of the decade. It's, I think, already the third biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, although its per capita emissions are low. It is just going to be more and more central to our lives. And we have this unique and unusual relationship, which brings some complexity, but also means that you have a Prime Minister of the United Kingdom who's called Rishi Sunak. So there are some, it's extraordinary in every way.
There's a significant demographic challenge to them, is there not? I mean, I think as India's population expands, so China is shrinking. Is that right? And therefore, presumably satisfying the needs of his
India's population. I think that is the great political challenge for any leader of India, is how do you create jobs for people? Because the median age of India is 28, UK is 41, I think, China, I think, I'm not so good on China, I think is in the mid-30s, and will age very fast, as all of the Asian countries will age much faster than, what's the case, Latin American countries, who in turn age much faster than the European countries. So it provides both a risk and an opportunity. It's interesting to me that the Indian government didn't make a great thing out of effectively becoming the world's most populous country. And usually an Indian government doesn't miss an opportunity to talk up, like any government, it's what's going on. So I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword. It does provide a huge opportunity. And I think more of those folks will become greater consumers, including of UK goods and services. But at the same time, you've got to find them jobs, or you've got to create an economy which gives them jobs. But it will, if you have a denominator of 1.4 billion, everything looks quite big.
And Alex, as you sort of bat for Britain in your role as ambassador, where are the trading opportunities for UK companies?
So I should say we do a lot of investment in each other's economies. Where India is now the second biggest investor in terms of flow, new projects into the UK. Although the stock is slightly smaller. UK stock, fifth biggest investor in India. So it's big. It's actually underperformed on trade, although trade is picking up quite fast now, up to about $33 billion, I think, last year. But still, actually, I would say relatively underperforming with two countries with such a historic relationship. Where are the big opportunities? There's obviously a big opportunity in everything around infrastructure. India will go through a huge infrastructure boom in the next 10 years. It's already in it, to be honest. So it's not surprising when you see, in relation to connectivity, for example, Virgin just announced the other day increase in flights. There'll be the flow of people. It will be huge. So connectivity and infrastructure. I would say pharma. India will remain one of the biggest suppliers of pharma goods to the world. Everything to do with leisure. India will become much, much more attractive as a place to do business. Financial services, UK companies are obviously very heavily established in India, and I think will probably become even more so. Then there's something around the kind of or tipping over from just pure business into technology, and technology which serves where we are. UK is a very good producer of technology which can be adapted to Indian circumstances. If you think about the sort of perfect example of that would be the Covishield vaccine, as it's called in India, which is the AstraZeneca vaccine. UK and India did more good for the world through the collaboration on that than anything else. And you take a UK origin vaccine started by an excellent university with a bit of public money, and then ultimately manufactured at vast scale at low cost by an Indian manufacturer, which obviously Indian companies are very expert at. And you have something which has huge impact on the world. So when you can match sort of British technology and research with Indian scale, I think you are onto a very, very good thing.
Yeah. That slightly leads me to sort of think a little bit about education opportunities at higher level for Indian students. And there's even been talk of possibly direct flights to Scotland from India at some point. There are Chinese flights now. How do you see that? And has the question of visas been resolved, post-study visas?
So education is a big growth area. Indians will put their extra rupee into their child's education more than almost anything else. And Indian students are now number one. They've overtaken Chinese students this year in terms of student visas issued. That is slightly dependent, just not slightly, very dependent on UK regulation, in particular whether you can continue to work. You can work during your study and after your study, which the UK used to allow, then stopped in 2012, 2013. That saw the numbers of students plummet. And now the number of students have shot up as a result of reintroducing the post-study work visa. And Indian students will always want to work after they finish their studies. So at the moment, the UK is doing extremely well out of it. There's no, I don't see a kind of pushback in India against this. I think people are quite happy for people who go and study abroad, not least because the competition to get to Indian universities for subjects like STEM is so intense. On visas more broadly, that question is never settled, because the question of migration is never a settled question in any British government that I've worked with. But India tops all of the main visa categories now, whether that's students. I've just referred to skilled work visas, where I think 42% of all skilled work visas go to Indian nationals, or indeed of visit visas. And at the same time, we work increasingly closely with the Indian government about dealing with illegal migration, because I think that's the sort of political quid pro quo. I think British ministers would say, we're relatively open on legal migration, but we have to be tough on illegal migration. But what I would like to do more of, there's a huge flow of Indian nationals coming to the UK. I'd like more Brits to go to India. I think we're still pretty ignorant. I'm sure not this crowd I'm speaking to, but overall we are pretty ignorant about what happens in India. And I would like, and one thing I'm really trying to work up with the British Council, Alison, who leads the British Council, is to get a kind of quite a big chunk in the thousands of young Brits to be able to come to India each year under a program where they can actually get experience for at least a few weeks, maybe a couple of months, of what the reality of India today is, because otherwise it tends to be very distorted reality, which people get shown through the media. So, and what the final thing I would say on visas is we underestimated the speed and the scale of the uptake after COVID of travel from India to the UK. I think now, and so the waiting times were very long. They are now much shorter. The outstanding job done by our visa team in Delhi, who cover India, not just India, for visit visas. And now, with the help of excellent work from the Indian High Commissioner to the UK, we now have e-visas for visits from Brits to India. So actually, I think it's getting a lot easier. It still costs you a bit of money, but it is getting a lot easier than it was a year ago.
Well, anything we can do in Scotland to promote that concept and that mission to get more Brits to go, we would be happy to work with the British Council on that. This slightly brings me on to India's role as a global player, particularly, of course, with its G20 presidency now. How do you see that developing? It's sort of the view from over here is that Mr. Modi's Hindu nationalism looks rather unattractive to many people, not least people who are admirers of Lutyens' architecture, of course, given what's going on in New Delhi. But are they ready to play more of a role in international affairs, do you think?
There's a lot I could unpack in that question,
right.
Ronnie. I'm not sure that Hindu nationalism and Lutyens' architecture. Actually, one thing I noticed about the Indian government is it's not a destroyer of things. It is a builder of other things, but it is not a knocker down. In fact, what's interesting to me, you're walking through Lutyens' Delhi, is how it's preserved and still used. Although obviously they're building new buildings as well, and they'll want to try and turn some more of the Lutyens stuff into museums and so forth. India, in a way, India is born in tension and conflict because of partition. So it's very used to living in a difficult neighborhood. And I think it's at the sharp end of pressure from China, having a still unresolved 2,000 mile border. So they are very used to having to deal with border issues with China, as well as, of course, with Pakistan as well. So in their neighborhood, they're very, they have a complicated neighborhood. What is happening at the same time is India's sort of global emergence beyond its immediate border. And I think its concept of what its sort of neighborhood has grown a lot over the last few years, partly because of Chinese influence and effect in a wider neighborhood, including the Pacific, and getting down towards a lot of smaller islands. So, but at the same time, it has the G20 presidency. It sees this as an opportunity to show its power in the world. So it actually switched its G20 presidency with Indonesia to go after Indonesia. I suspect at the time it was thinking this is a good lead into the domestic campaign for the elections in May, general elections in May 2024. Now, the macro scenario, obviously, or the immediate scenario of Russia-Ukraine is a very depressing one. And that makes it much harder for the world to agree about anything. India's pretty good at kind of being able to talk to everybody, including Russians, including the US. When I went on to the INS Vikrant, the new Indian aircraft carrier for its commissioning, I was thinking this is the only place in the world where you'll see an American and a Russian jets in the same aircraft hangar. But it is getting harder and harder to do the geopolitical splits at the moment, and that I think is causing some, I wouldn't say anxiety, but quite a lot of thought in India about how do you manage what could be a very bumpy G20. Go on.
There's a question here from Elizabeth Marshall, who says, do you think India would be a peacemaker in the Russia-Ukrainian conflict?
No, I don't think so, Elizabeth. I kind of wondered about that. But I think that whilst India is capable of speaking to all sides, I think it'll be cautious about trying to make peace until there's clearly a peace to make. And that, I think, will depend on the situation on the ground in Ukraine and the ability of the Ukrainians with support from the UK and others to push the Russians back from the occupation of Ukrainian territory. So I suspect they'll remain careful for now. What they won't do is clearly side with one or the other, which could make them, indeed, in theory, good peace brokers, but I think they'll be pretty cautious for now. What they'll want to do, Elizabeth, is to try to get through the G20 summit in a way where they can talk not just about Russia-Ukraine, although that might be that it's going to be the dominant theme, but also about some of the other things they want to talk about on sustainability, on digital transformation, and on the fact that because on the Sustainable Development Goals, we are well off track. There'll be a kind of midterm summit just around the time of the G20 as well, looking at the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think the Indian government would like to speak a lot more about that, but I'm afraid that Russia invading Ukraine has made that harder.
Yeah, okay. Climate, I'm sure, will come up during the G20 one way or another, because Elizabeth has another question, which is, some think there could be 600 million people in North India left short of water. Do you agree?
I think that climate change is very often talked about in India through water rather than as climate change. And I think that anything which involves Indian agriculture is extremely sensitive and of great popular interest. And if climate change is, amongst other things, an enormous water transfer from ice to seawater, India is going to be affected by it more than almost any other country in the world. So you do see a lot of discussion now about water and about the sustainability of agriculture. Now, India remains an extraordinarily generous country to its farmers in terms of water and electricity, and changing that is really hard politically. But I do think that it is becoming, essentially, you can see the effects of climate change already in India. For example, dengue. Dengue didn't really, I was listening to an expert the other day saying dengue didn't really exist in Delhi 25 years ago, and now it certainly does, and that's because the vector, the mosquito, is more prevalent in Delhi than it was 25 years ago. So I think people in India do feel, and maybe people on the call, who would know this better than me, but they do feel that the consequences of climate change, very much. So I don't know whether they will run out of water, but I think that India will have to address not just kind of the cutting of emissions, but also how it can deal with the consequences of climate change. And we do a lot of work with the Indian government and states about that.
There's an anonymous question now. It says CDC, now BII, has invested in India renewables and climate change responses. Ayana with the BP, that's light source, involvement, for instance. How is that going, and should the renewable energy sector, in your view, Alex, in the UK be doing more to work with them?
Usually when you get anonymous questions, they're sort of mildly abusive. They don't ask you rather interesting and good points, technical questions about renewable energy. We do an awful lot on renewable energy, both commercially and through some development work with the Indian government. You're absolutely right. So the kind of the sort of private capital bits of British government, so CDC, and now BII, and also another thing we have called DevCap, which creates funds with the Indian government. Those really go mainly into renewable energy and into other forms of sustainability, and they have done very well indeed. And this is a huge growth area. Offshore wind, since we're here running in Scotland, India is really about to get into offshore wind in quite a big way. I mean, big, small by Indian standards, big by everybody else's standards in the states of Tamil Nadu and Gujarat. And we do a lot of work on the policies around that and in trying to introduce the UK supply chain as well into India. It will be, I mean, the scale of what will happen on renewables in India is absolutely mind-blowing in terms of installed capacity. Their targets are very ambitious. I don't know whether they'll meet them, but they will grow vastly. I mean, this, in solar and in wind, and also increasingly they will go for green hydrogen as well. So I would say there's some development, there's some work we do as governments. on research, on policies, but also I think there will be huge investments in it. One of the things I'd like to get more of actually are institutional investors in India and UK investing more on these and this sort of the big infrastructure and renewables effort over the next decade or so.
Got a question here from Martin Allen. He says, is there still COVID restriction in India for entry? And has the recent data breach in India in relation to COVID vaccines, is there any problem foreseen? The Indian foreign minister, he says, is very robust. And is he respected in India also?
You should, if anyone asks you whether the foreign minister of your host country is respected in that country, the answer is always yes. And it is true in this case as well. I'm not aware really of COVID restrictions anymore. Certainly traveling around India or going back. There were a few last summer, but I think they've gone now. But it's better to consult the Indian government website on that. The breach is actually a reminder of another area. We do a lot of work together, which is on cybersecurity, where that matters a great deal to India. We feel we face some of the same risks on cybersecurity, and actually we do increasing amounts of cooperation together. That's state to state, but it's also how do you help companies and private organizations, like hospitals, for example, to protect their data in a more effective way. Because if you think about the connections between the UK economy and the Indian economy, one of them is the enormous number of people employed in India working for British-based firms on what was once called the back office, but certainly a great deal more than that now. Our financial services providers, Tesco, for example, they have huge numbers of staff operating, for example, their online deliveries, what you make of a morning or an evening. And so it's quite important that their data can be protected as well. Now, the companies do that, but you need a kind of a state infrastructure and policies which will help you to do that. So we talk to the Indians quite a lot about that.
William, you're right. William Crawley asks, is India's relationship with the UK seen as less valuable to India since Britain left the European Union? A subject with which you are extremely familiar, of course.
Thank you so much for asking that question. So I actually think the Indian government sees some opportunity in the fact we're outside the European Union in two respects. One is to do a free trade agreement, which I think the Indian government is trying to do with the EU, but I think it's much harder because the EU as a whole has many more agricultural interests, both offensive and defensive, as they say in the trade jargon. And secondly, on migration, where they see an opportunity for a different kind of migration policy. And in both cases, they would be right. The UK migration policy is now relatively more liberal to Indian nationals than it was when we were members of the European Union. And I think they probably have we have a better chance of doing an FTA with India outside the European Union, which is part of the European Union. That's not to comment on the pluses and minuses of Brexit, because that's a thing which has now been done. But I do notice those are two areas of opportunity which now develop with us outside the European Union.
I know that both sides, someone says here, were ambitious about concluding the FTA by last year's Diwali. Can we expect a successful agreement by this Diwali? I think our current Prime Minister is a man who's very cautious about setting what he might regard as artificial deadlines. Our previous Prime Minister, but one was quite keen on doing that kind of thing. So each to their own style of governing. Actually, we are now really into the end game of the negotiations. I think we'll do it in the next few months, or we won't do it because both countries will go into domestic political campaigns next year, which will dominate. And I don't think you're going to face down your opponents of an FTA in an election year and the months coming up to an election. So I think that. But I think we have a chance to do it. Sometimes I'm optimistic, sometimes I'm pessimistic. But actually, I think there is quite strong political will on both sides to try and do this deal. But you have to translate that into the painful business of negotiation. And you have to keep your eyes on the prize. So I think we could do it. But we're going to need some help, folks. We're going to need some people who think this is a good thing to be saying so in public, because otherwise it risks dying a sort of slow death from indifference, public indifference. And here's a question. As India increasingly centralizes, what is the future of federalism with the Union?
Yeah, I think that the kind of centralization of India ebbs and flows. It's not a kind of, and it ebbs and flows, I think, according to the power of the center and of the government center. And usually at the moment, you have a government which has a very strong hold on parliament. Very popular governments in the last election did very well. And so, but the Indian constitution is the Indian constitution, and it devolves quite a lot of power. You have quite a lot of world powers, you have quite a lot of shared powers, and then you have some reserve powers, as we might say in the UK. And so I do think that comes and goes. And you have a strong centre at the moment. That, for example, makes it easier to try and negotiate an FTA because you know that your people you're negotiating with can deliver it through their parliaments. If you remember, thank you so much, Roddy, for reminding me of my former days in the Department for Ex and European Union. One of the problems there was we were negotiating. Our issue was not so much with our negotiating partner, but that they did not believe that the executive could deliver the legislature. And for a while, they were right. The executive could not get it negotiated deals through our legislature. That is not a problem with India at the moment in relation to the FTA. But as I say, I think the power of the state, the power of the states, kind of does ebb and flow quite a lot.
We're getting near to the time limit that you have today because you have a train to catch. Would you like to just sort of draw together your thoughts on India's future, having been, I think, there since 21, is that right? 21?
Yeah, that's right. I've got 11 minutes, Roddy, so we can rattle through a few. 11
okay,
minutes.
Good.
I was.
Then I'll stop you because in that case I am going to ask another question. This is
Sure.
Joseph Black, who says, this is apropos of, I think, students and people going to India. Australia has a program called the New Colombo Plan, which brings Australians to places throughout Asia to study and build understandings of Asia. Does the UK have something like this, or is this something that could be introduced?
Yeah, Joseph, that's exactly what I want to try and create with the British councils. Essentially, my aim is to get 10,000 young Brits per year to come to India for at least 6 weeks. And I'll need some help from universities and from companies, but I think it's really important. There's a question further down, Roddy, from Martin Allen saying, universities up to UK Indian student expectations. Does UK welcome to them? Yes, is the answer. Yeah, Indian students are pouring into UK universities. What has happened in the past is attempts to try and get more young Brits to go to India have not worked because Indian universities are not up to British students' expectations. Now you have some new universities in India, and you definitely have better ways of getting young Brits to India. But I also would like them to go and work there, intern and stuff like that, and just get a sense of the reality of India today. Because you sometimes do get slightly weirdly distorted views of India and the UK. It's either the Raj or it's snake charmers or, all that kind of stuff from Mother Teresa. And actually the kind of reality of India, as many of the people on the call will know, is quite different to that in many ways. Although India being so large, you can find almost whatever you want within it that you're looking for.
There was another question I saw. If the UK were to apply to join the Quad, would India be ambivalent or encouraging?
Yeah, and I might take Jeremy Grant's question as well about views of Southeast Asia. I do. Yeah. I think that my advice to ministers is that don't push to join the Quad. Members of the Quad are quite happy with it as it is. The Quad really ebbs and flows according to how much the four members of it, Japan, the US, Australia, and India, are interested, have a similar view of China. And sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. When they don't, the Quad doesn't flourish. At the moment they do, and it's a pretty wary view, so it is flourishing. I don't think they need anyone else in there. What we should do is be working with the countries of the Quad, and sometimes with more than one country of the Quad, to achieve the effects that we want to for the United Kingdom, and that is particularly on security. So one of the big growth area has been naval cooperation. We have a really very noticeable increase in naval cooperation in the last 3 years, and that's because India is interested in the UK's Navy and what we can bring into the Indo-Pacific region, and our Navy is interested in that as well. And we should be cooperating more with the Japanese, with the Australians, and with the Americans, with the Indians in relation to how you ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific. I think, Jeremy, your question is. You're absolutely right. India is very interested in Southeast Asia. Curiously, it's turned away from Southeast Asia on trade deals. This government's very critical of its predecessors' trade deals with Japan and one or two others, I think, in the region, and is much more focused on the most developed economies. So they've done Australia and UAE, and we're trying to do one at the moment. They're looking at the EU and Canada as well. But they see themselves, the Indian government and Indian strategists see themselves in a tremendous tussle with China. About power and influence in the region. That's whether in Myanmar, Nepal, Sri Lanka, now more into the Maldives, Indonesia as well. Now, to the extent to which India has power in all those places, it's for others to judge, but they do see now that this is a theatre is too dramatic a word, but an area where they need to do much more, and so they are.
And India within the Commonwealth, it's not a question that's been asked, playing
it's a good question,
role in what is the largest coalition of the willing in the world. What do you think?
So I think, people have always been a bit wary about it, a bit skeptical about it. But funnily enough, I think that the Commonwealth is very interesting to India because it's a large organization which doesn't include China and does include a lot of countries in its region. So I think this is a bit of a slow burn, but I think one of the interesting potential growth areas will be in the Commonwealth. People have said this before, people are a bit wary about it, but actually I think there's a bit of untapped potential there.
There is a question here from Victoria Schofield. Please, could you talk a bit about the situation in Jammu and Kashmir? It's nearly 3 years since the abrogation of Article 370. When do you think statehood might be restored, Alex?
That's a very good question. I had thought that they would probably do it pre the general election in May next year, and that may be the case. I think the government having changed the constitution will then say, well, we're going to make sure the situation is secure, that the security is okay, and then we should run elections there. And I had always thought they would try and do that before the general election next year, but now I'm not quite so sure. Because I want to feel confident on the security situation and then to be able to run an election before then. But so we'll see. But I'm not quite sure as I was that there would be the restoration of statehood before the next election.
Okay. Here's a comment on Lutyens. I knew it would come back to bite me. Dr. Arvind Singh says, you talked about those that like Lutyens India. Alex Ellis points out that the Modi government is into building things. There are few former colonies that would not want to wipe out colonial legacy, hence the new Parliament for Independent India. UK should partner in Indians in building new infrastructure for a new young India.
Yeah, I'd rather agree with that. It's interesting to me that it isn't a place where the statue of George V got taken down, but I think that's kind of fair enough. And that was done in 1968, I think.
Yeah.
What I think... I would say the Indian government's very forward-looking. So, it says, come on, what are we going to do about the future? How are we going to build our infrastructure together? How are we going to deal with some of the issues which are of interest in the UK and India? It could be global health, it could be sustainability in India, but not just in India. And that, I think, is right. At the same time, there is a conversation that goes on about restoration of artifacts and so forth. That is kind of sometimes quite a charged conversation. But I think it's very interesting to see in the UK much more interest in kind of the history of empire. I was interested. I was chatting to a couple of people somebody doing A-level history yesterday. Once upon a time, I taught A-level history, saying that they were taught empire. This has been recently introduced into the curriculum. And then I asked, I hope you studied the history of the UK and Ireland. And they said they did, because I think that's a very important part of understanding the UK's relationship with the world. Mm-hmm. And that is, of course, particularly relevant to Scotland. I think, because given, my mum's Scots, my Scottish grandfather served in the Indian Army for a long time, given the number of Scots who travelled and were part of the British Empire, I think it's a very interesting part. In my family, they are, and I can't be alone in this, they were either in the army or they were in the church, and they did a bit of both.
There you go, depending upon which order they were born in, exactly. Alex, we are coming now sort of towards the end of our time. So your final thoughts on India's future.
Yeah, I think that, well, first of all, Roddy, thank you so much for setting this up. And again, apologies that I was slightly late to it. I think over the years, the UK has thought, well, India, it's interesting. It's, a fascinating place, interesting history, but sort of is it necessary? Because it's quite hard doing business in India one way or another. I don't think we have that choice anymore, given where I think India will go in the next 10 or 15 years. It has to move from the nice to the necessary pile. And it does require sustained effort over a long period of time. I always say that I do my job for my successors. And, things take 10 years. Yeah. But I've just been at Edinburgh University, Roddy, they've done some great work with the Biotech University of Gujarat, essentially to help to set it up. That's it takes a while, but you're in at the ground floor, and I do think that we need to make a more concerted effort, both from the government and also in the private sector, education and so forth, to actually be part of what that new India is, which one of the previous questions was pointing out. Thank you.
Alex, well, thank you very much. As you know from having talked to us in the past, our mission is to educate and inspire tomorrow's leaders in Scotland and elsewhere. And we set ourselves up bearing in mind that the majority of Scottish families had someone somewhere who went to India and China and elsewhere. And you go to the Scottish cemetery in Calcutta, it's full of the dead who fell ill whilst there. So your talk about India was hugely helpful, very interesting, and we're immensely grateful to you for taking the time to join us before heading south.
That's all right.
Very much.
All right. Nice to see you all. Thank you very much, Roddy.
Thanks. Bye-bye.